Great Evenings and Little Mornings Movie Review. Sorry, actually that's not the real title of this movie. That's just the English translation. The original title is in French, and I never learned how to pronounce French. So I'm going to mispronounce this, but Soirs et Petits Matins. Sorry. Yeah, I make this disclaimer every time I talk about something French. I'm very interested in French history, never learned how to speak French, so I embarrass myself every time I try and do a review of something related to France. Unfortunately for me, I've read a lot of books and watched a lot of movies relating to French history, so I always get myself into this position. Okay, right. What is this movie about? How did I end up seeing it? First of all, what is it about? I'm going to give some brief background on this, on the assumption that, this is the internet, so you never know who's watching or what level of background they have. This is about the May 1968 protests in France. Now, 1968, there were student protests all over the world for a variety of different reasons. And in May 1968, the students in Paris were protesting. I think a variety of different reasons. They were protesting capitalism, the Vietnam War, university rules, just kind of the normal counterculture stuff and political stuff that was in 1968. What made Paris unique is this protest just exploded. It was just huge. It started in the universities and then spilled out into the streets. And what happened in Paris, which never happened in the US, is this also spread to the workers. So like the trade unions, the labor unions, joined the students. So all of a sudden, not only did you have the students out protesting, but you had all the workers out protesting, which was not only massive protests in the streets and huge barricades and stuff like that, which completely overtook the streets of Paris, but also caused the economy of Paris to just, completely stop. And this, like a lot of the 1968 protests, it eventually petered out, but it was a huge deal at the time. Almost caused the collapse of the government of France. I think it caused the resignation of the president or the prime minister or whatever the system was at the time. Huge news all across the world at the time. But it, like a lot of stuff, it's kind of been forgotten now, or at least it's been forgotten in the US. So, like if you read like a publication from the US that was published around this time, people were like, wow, look at what's happening in France. Like, wow, France, huh? But, if you were born after 1968, you never hear about this in any kind of history because American history tends to be very American-centric. We talk about the 60s in America, but we never talk about the 60s in Europe in American history classes. But this was a big deal at the time. Now, how did I end up seeing this? This is a French film. It's a documentary film primarily composed of footage that was shot during the May 1968 protests. According to the internet, it was released in 1978, 10 years later. I don't know why it took them 10 years. Maybe it just took them 10 years to edit it, or I don't know. And it's never been released in America, and I don't think it's ever been subtitled in English. Certainly it's never been subtitled in English for any sort of wide release. But it was subtitled in Japanese and released on video in Japan, and I was living in Japan, so I saw this in my video store and rented it. Yeah, sort of a brief digression here, but if you've ever lived abroad, I'm sure you can kind of identify with this. Like when you live abroad, like when I lived in Japan, you have access to all this Japanese culture that never gets translated or kind of never gets across the Atlantic. Pacific. Never gets across the Pacific. Although, the internet is making the world smaller and smaller all the time, so this is changing all the time. But, there's all this stuff in Japanese culture that just never makes it big over in the US, so when you're living in Japan, you have more access to that. But, not only that, but there are things from other cultures that make it big in certain countries that don't make it big in other countries. For example, there's a lot of stuff from French culture that is big in Japan that never makes it over to the US. So if you're living in Japan, you get exposed to French culture via Japan that was never big over in the US. And there are lots of examples of this, actually. There are a lot of kind of French novels or stories. Arsène Lupin was really big in Japan. There's a whole anime about him. He was a French, a French pulp fiction character. A lot of pop songs in France, specifically kind of in the 1960s, which never got big in the US, were big in Japan. I found out about them because there were Japanese covers of French pop songs from the 1960s. And then I guess this movie is another example. Never released in America, never subtitled in English, but subtitled into Japanese and released in the Japanese video stores. So sorry, that was a long introduction to this. But yeah, that's kind of why I ended up seeing this movie. I, as someone who was fascinated with the student protests in the 1960s, as soon as I saw this movie in the video store, I just kind of snatched it up. I don't speak French, and my Japanese level is, well, it varied throughout the years, but at my peak I was about maybe upper intermediate. So I was reading the Japanese subtitles. I couldn't understand the French, so I was reading the Japanese subtitles. And I could understand maybe about half of it. And then about half of it I couldn't understand. Now, some of this requires no translation. So when they're showing footages of the riots from May 1968 in Paris, the marching in the streets, the overturned cars, the street barricades, you don't really need a translation for that. You can just kind of see the visuals. But there are also scenes of people talking, people kind of debating politics on the streets with each other, which the camera has been able to pick up. And that, that was hit and miss for me. But I felt like I got like a feel for what was going on for this movie. And I'm sure if I wanted to learn more about the May 1968 protests, I could probably find a book somewhere. Where could I actually? I was just complaining about how this stuff has kind of been completely forgotten in American culture. I'm sure you could find information somewhere. So, I would have loved to understand this movie more, but to the extent I understood it, I found it very interesting. The point of a documentary, of course, is just to see the images. And this movie does a great job of it. This movie is just pure archival footage. So it's a documentary, but it's not like a documentary in the sense that like there's talking heads or interviews with historians. It's just purely a compilation of footage from actually being there. But yeah, it's got footage from everywhere. Like the camera is able to get everywhere. Heated conversations on street corners between ordinary people, speeches in crowded theaters. The camera's even there at the student planning meetings when they're kind of planning the demonstrations for the next day. If you know anything about May 1968 in France, you know that kind of the leading figure, kind of the celebrity leader associated with it, is a guy named Daniel Cohn-Bendit. I'm mispronouncing his name, I'm sure. Although he actually wasn't French. He was a German student studying in France. But he became the leader behind that protest, or I guess the big name associated with it. And there's some footage of him giving speeches and answering questions. Yeah. I mentioned the title of the film is Big Nights or Big Evenings, Small Mornings. And a lot of the rioting appears to have taken place at night, or at least that's the impression you get from the film. So it doesn't show up well on the screen. You know, it's kind of dark, grainy footage, difficult to understand what's going on. In the mornings, you've got like the discussions on the streets and the theaters, which actually occupy the majority of the film, is the discussions. That shows up clearly, but I had trouble understanding what was going on because I was relying on the Japanese subtitles. Yeah. I think you can find copies of this movie on the internet quite easily nowadays. And even on YouTube, I think, if you search it. Finding English translation might be more of a difficulty, but if you're a history nerd or if you're interested in this kind of stuff, it's fascinating just to watch just for the visuals. And so I give it maybe a cautious recommendation based on that. Oh, one side note, and a lot of the crowd footage of this movie, the crowd is singing the Internationale, the International Communist Anthem, which has been translated into almost every language, but which was originally written in French. So I guess it's kind of fitting that this French film, they're singing it all the time. I was thinking, I'm not sure if there's a record, if anyone's keeping track of the most times the Internationale is sung in a film. But this film, if anyone's keeping track of it, this film has got to be pretty close to the record. Because it just seems to pop up again and again and again. Every time they show footage of the crowds marching, they're always singing that song. Okay, that's all I've got on this.